I want to talk about those books that I might read on my deathbed. I hope that it is some distance away from now, and I hope I'm not tempting fate. Nonetheless, I have given it some thought, as we often do, not necessarily about what books, but just our dying. Maybe we don't. Maybe that's something I do. Um, I think I've covered the music off. That's very clear to me. I will mostly listen to Bach and uh, mostly listen to the English suites played by Ivo Pogorelich um, and the Well Tempered Clavier I can't remember his name. I mean, I can, but by Richter. Um, Sviatoslav Richter. That's what I was trying to say. Okay, but so that's books. Oh no, sorry. The music will be Bach by Pogorelich and Richter, and then there'll be the last Beethoven string quartets by the Veil Quartet, extraordinary Hungarian quartet. Um, so that's the music covered off. But the books, I think the first thing to think about is what writing does to us, or writing we love, and I think does one or two things. The greatest writing, it either creates a kind of quickening of the senses, or slightly more profoundly a kind of falling away of our heart, perhaps. And I feel that a quickening of the senses is probably not right for our dying moments, but a falling away is somehow appropriate. And what I mean by falling away, and it's obviously a very subtle sense, but I think we felt it when we are confronted with a moment of great beauty. And it tends to be art. It doesn't tend to be a landscape, or maybe it is sometimes a person actually. But we suddenly feel part of us fall away. And I think it falls away because we are confronted with the ungraspability of the unknown. That something within us recognizes something that we can't take hold of. And it's the falling away is the sudden understanding of our inability to really come to terms with something which is beyond us. But it is a recognition of that. And I feel that it's an important expression of. I mean, some people talk about some people who are atheists or materialists or whatever want to talk about that doesn't stop them having a genuine reaction to the numinous. Chris Hitchens often talks about that, about he's still open to the numinous. But I think what I think about falling away and the numinous are different. The numinous is actually something actually very, very straightforwardly life affirming, whereas the falling away is actually other affirming. It's affirming of something beyond us and our inability to grasp it, to comprehend it, to completely own it. And we may be startled in front of the numinous, but I think we can go one-on-one with it. But I don't think that happens when the world just falls away from us and we are confronted with a kind of abyss, but abyss in that way that something resides there. And certain writing does that. So I went on a bit long there. Clearly, poetry is ideal for death, because it's often short. But I have 3 novels and 3 poets. But before I get to the 3 novels, I'm going to this little slightly mad anecdote that when I was in my 20s and I was reading Proust for the first time, I had this rather stupidly romantic notion that I would read the last volume on my deathbed. Um, and since that point, I've never been able to read the last volume because I feared that it would be my deathbed. And it has become a superstition. So I've never read A Time Regained, although I've read all the other volumes a number of times in a number of different translations. So half of this, because part of it is a guide to Proust, is A Time Regained, and I haven't read it. So I do feel that it's important that I read that on my deathbed. I get that done because that would be rather awful, I think, and not to have read Proust so much and not to have read the end. But poetry is probably the ideal. And I will go on to the novels. The poet I will read most of will be Wallace Stevens, because it is the poet I read most of. Wallace Stevens is the poet. For me, is the kind of keenest, most phenomenological poet, which is in a sense he's interested in the transience of perception and the ability of poetry to pause and find the weight behind the material world that in our daily lives is in flux. And I think what's important about that is that Stevens is the poet that most, because I think he senses that the world exists in flux before poetry and then in flux after poetry, and poetry just sits there and tries to pin it down more or less successfully. His enterprise is actually a metaphor for existence, in the sense that there is that perfect balance between how much I'm going to go that way, how much we didn't exist, then we exist, to how much we don't exist after we die. And life is the pivot between the two infinite and indefinite states of non-being. And I think that on some level that's what Wallace Stevens does. So to read that on our deathbed, I think is important, or rather I think for me will make me understand the pivot that is my life between two states of non-being. The next poet will be, what's his initial name? John Donne. And actually, I will read his early erotic poems because they do, for me, create a kind of falling away. He's extraordinary on the nature of love and sensual love, and then there is the most extraordinary moment in A Mistress Going to Bed, which I can read over and over again. So I'm sure I will go there. But finally, I don't think there's any poet, simply because of the concentration, how condensed the thoughts are, to be able to have not much time and want to read deeply. Emily Dickinson, and perhaps one poem, I'm going to try and read it, is perfect. And this is it. There is a pain so utter it swallows substance up, and covers the abyss with trance, so memory can step around across upon it, as one within a swoon goes safely where an open eye would drop him bone by bone. What's weird about that actually is that around across upon it is very much like those wonderful lines above, below, etc. in the John Donne, and the notion of swallowing substance up is a theme in Stevens. But there probably aren't the few poems of 8 lines that quite deal quite so deeply with that notion of falling away that I talk about and the end of life. And Dickinson is just, it's one of the geniuses of geniuses of geniuses. But quick novels, I will definitely reread Light Years by James Salter because it's the prose I love most, and it is such a sort of novel of fatedness, and ultimately unhappiness, even though the sort of concept of the novel, light years, i.e., sort of light in that whole notion of the unbearable lightness of being, that every year of the people's life is summed up in a kind of single moment that is ungraspable. Use that word too often, but anyway. So there's that. There's also Nikos Kazantzakis' The Last Temptation, or The Last Temptation of Christ, if you've heard of or seen the Scorsese film, which is of which one should park and never see, or he didn't have very much money, and this is a book of deep seriousness. And I think what it is it's the life of Jesus, not the life of Christ or the life of Jesus Christ. It's the life of Jesus, and how he makes the decision, I think the human decision, to become the Christ. Not God's decision, it's a human decision. It is a deeply Christian book. It's a deeply human book. And I can think of no other book that talks about our responsibilities as human beings. To slightly give the spoiler away, whatever, to slightly give the plot away, or the story away. It's not really a plot, is it? Is that he chooses not to become the Lamb of God, the sacrificial Lamb, which is to offer himself up for the crucifixion, but then to live a normal life beyond that, and then to understand what his deeper responsibility is, and that maybe is, and so it's not God's will; it is a human being's will. So it is extraordinary, and I recommend anyone who hasn't read it who's read it. But finally, and no shock to anyone, Gilead by Marilynne Robinson, which is essentially an epistolary novel, because it's sort of in letter form, but one letter, by an aging man to his son, his young son, 7 or 8 years old, and he's in his late 70s. And having children of my own, I can imagine that I hope they are grown up by the time I'm in at that point that we're talking about now. But I love this book. I think it is just one of the most beautifully kind of ordinary testaments to goodness, because the central character is a good man, and literature is full of more interesting characters, and to be interesting you have to be more ambiguous. But this succeeds because Ames is good and is full of love and is doing the right thing. And that's a very strong, the genius of Marilynne Robinson. She makes it so compelling that we're not even aware that we are occupying a world that that has any contrived darkness. It is not. And anyway, it's, hey, I'm dying. It's my choice. I've chosen 2 books that are to a certain degree about religion, but I don't think that's meaningful, because certainly I don't see it that way. I think I'm reading books that are very profound about the human condition, its frailty, its transience, but ultimately the reason we go to art, poetry, novels, music is that that our being yearns towards something that we can't quite grasp, and that's why we fear death. But I think I'd rather like to go to death, knowing in life that my body and my mind were still yearning forward, or yearning over, if you will. Thank you.